So this is our advisory group. The advisory group, as just kind of reminder, we're on our third meeting, but this group was a cross-section of folks to help us vet ideas before we bring it out to the greater public. We have property owners, town meeting members, and community leaders of different sorts. So thank you for making time on this Thursday summer evening. So appreciate it. Some people have come from long distances because they understand how important it is. It seems so abstract in so many ways when you're talking about zoning. But as I've mentioned a number of times through this process, it's one of our most powerful tools. And our planning board members here, Jess and Brenda, know that. Our planning director, who lives and breathes this stuff every day, knows that. And my role is, economic development, looking into the future. What we're trying to do is position ourselves in a way that we remain relevant. If we don't adapt and change, we can't meet kind of the demands of the future, whether that be in housing, real estate, or access to jobs. So a lot of what we've been looking at is where is opportunity within our commercial district. And I've mentioned this a few different times over the last couple meetings, but this corridor has been kind of our economic engine with the majority of our jobs in commercial tax base. But it also was of a certain era. The built environment, as you can see through that, is spread out and somewhat dated. Our master plan that we worked on for several years really asked us to look at how we can move out of a dated suburban built environment and more to a little denser, more mixed use, where we're putting uses together so we can walk to them, so we can reduce some reliance on our cars. And so we can have more opportunities for kind of life to unfold, whether it's for living, whether it's for working, or just enjoyment of life, what through experiential uses, retail, or entertainment. So that's what we're really working on. Through this 500 acres, there's 100 acres of infill opportunity, and what we're trying to do, and what our job is here tonight, is to really understand where we've come from today with our consultants and how we can unlock that opportunity to kind of guide development for the next 20 years. So Ted, Peter, I'm gonna let you take it from here. You got the information, everyone knows the information, and we are recording this for those who can't make it, so I'm gonna ask you guys to speak here as well.
Right. Do you want to say anything before we start?
No, let's go ahead.
All right, so what we want to do tonight is try to narrow down the number of decisions that need to be made and the amount of a consensus that need to be built. So we're sort of starting with the big ideas, and hopefully you'll all say, this is great, keep moving forward. And then if not, we can identify those areas that we're not quite ready to say, let's move forward. One of those we'll talk about later is the potential rezoning and which parcels are in and what that means. So sort of wanted to start, how many people came to the 3-day charrette that we had? So about half. So we're going to talk a little bit about the process, sort of what we've learned so far from the charrette and the other presentations. We're going to talk about, as I said, the sort of larger basic zoning recommendations, and then look at a little more detail on sort of reviewing the proposed zoning changes, the map, the table of use, which is a lot of fun, parking requirements, which we don't have any coffee, but maybe we'll send out. But these things are important because right now the parking really limits the amount of development. That and the FAR determine how much you can build. And so by jiggering that and thinking about some options, which Ted is going to talk about, we can really start to create an incentive for people to do new and better things. So we had our advisory group meeting number 1, the public forum number 1 in like January and February. We sort of looked at the basic strengths and weaknesses of the study area. We did stakeholder interviews, which you're still doing some stakeholder interviews, I guess, or is that winding down?
But I'm open to more.
Kind of learning about the needs and plans of the specific property owners. We learned a lot of great information. We got the second advisory group in April that you recall, where we looked at plans around the tables, and then we did the design charrette for a few days in May. And really the idea, the charrette was sort of designed to drill down to some of the questions that built or sort of emerged from the earlier part of the process. So really look at, if we have strengths, what are they and why are they? What are the weaknesses really? What are the opportunities for the area as a whole and specific sites? And to really start to think about what's possible from the perspective of property owners, their representatives, and you as representatives of the town and town meeting. So there's a lot of possibilities, but only a few that actually are maybe workable within the context of all of that. So that's what we're looking for. So one of the things we did at the Charette is sort of pull out the phase 1 master plan, really think about what ideas do we agree with, what do we not agree with. And pretty much there seemed to be strong support for the idea of sort of open space networks that would connect through the district and connect to the park and to the Vinebrook corridor, to do complete streets. We'll talk more about that, and make street connections, and then continue that idea of continuous pedestrian paths. So to the extent we can, is to knit together what's now a little too much a series of separate parcels and activities, and over time to make that into one thing that is recognizable as a single thing. So, as it says here, we wanted to get feedback on questions left over open by the concept plan as we move forward with the charrette. Particularly, should the whole study area be treated the same by zoning, or do some parts need different zoning requirements? Basically because there are logical activity centers within the district, and phase 1 kind of treated all those different nodes the same, when in fact what emerged from the charrette is that basically some of them are big regional or even statewide visitation draws. People come from all over to go to the mall, to the hospital, and to some of the retail centers. And then there's others that are nodes for just a particular neighborhood, or maybe people come from the surrounding towns but not from the region, and so on. And how much residential is appropriate? Where should it be located? This is a fundamental question which we want to talk about tonight, because there's a lot of potential development space there, and if you fill it all up with apartments, it's a lot. So the question is, where do you start, and how do you parcel that out, literally? And then what are the community's design preferences for things like the public realm of streetscapes and open space and building design? So as you recall, if you were at the Charrette, we had a series of exercises designed to explore those different ideas, and in a large sense think about where do we set the balance between flexibility and predictability in the zoning. So I'm going to go through sort of a series of these themes and sort of what we learned, the big ideas that came out from the community and from the property owners, and then what our sort of preliminary recommendations are. So what we heard is that there's strong community support for a continuous pedestrian spine, long-term to build that into something that fits into the town-wide greenway network, and to make it a shared use path that's green and shaded and works for people walking, biking, etc. For property owners, heard a little different take on that. So they're generally okay with pedestrian paths across the sites, but they're really asking for flexibility so that we don't put it on a plan and say you must build it here, but really it's something they're required to include it in the plans and show where it's going to be, but to make it work within their plan. And we heard loud and clear that it's difficult to coordinate across property lines, but that changing the zoning requirements could help motivate cooperation. If you provide an incentive for connecting, people will. So here's some of the options for how to implement that idea of a continuous pedestrian spine. So I'm going to present all of these and sort of give you our conclusions. So one is you have a regulating plan that says there's a specific location for a path. So on this zoning map, we say here's where the path should go, even if it's going across someone's lot. Second option is that zoning establish a general requirement for pedestrian connections across properties with some minimal design standards to sort of make it consistent as it goes through the whole district. And that the vision plan establishes the preferred location for the path as kind of a demonstration of what we're talking about. So we have the beginnings of a big plan we did at the Charrette, which shows one idea. So we'll have a plan which sort of demonstrates how that could happen, and then that's used as kind of a check for when people come forward with a plan and a proposal to develop. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of recommendations. Should we stop after each of these and see if there's any questions? Sure. I think, so is there any thoughts about the idea of the continuous pedestrian spine and these conclusions? Everyone agrees? I don't know why we have to call it a pedestrian spine, but we're professionals and we're charging a lot of money, so we have to give it a term like that. Yeah.
Are you recommending those three? Are you recommending 2 and 3? I mean, what are you looking for?
Basically 2 and 3. So it's, the zoning says, when you come forward with a plan, show us how you're fitting into the pedestrian system. But we're not putting it on a map. But it will be on a vision plan to say, this is the vision from 2023. Please be consistent with this. And if you ignore it entirely, we want to know why. So again, it's trying to set that balance between requiring it in the zoning and giving people flexibility to put it where it works on their site. In the back first.
Sure. I think maybe the label may not be the greatest label to use pedestrian spine. The pedestrian connectivity and continuity,
Right.
I think is fair. One thing that I sort of worry about is if there's 2 adjacent pieces of property, and one property does something that's redeveloped and they have a pedestrian connection that terminates at the edge of their property, that next property owner suddenly loses some flexibility with that connection point. I don't know how you work its way through that in terms of maintaining the ability to create pedestrian connectivities, but maintaining that flexibility too.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's like any other kind of subdivision development, right? Off in the countryside, the first developer in gets to decide where the road goes. But typically, a planning board will look at the plan when it's proposed and say, how is this going to connect to the neighbor? And does this fit our preliminary idea? And then they would have to, I mean, those are frequently adjusted in real time when you're doing the review. Other questions?
You mentioned you had conflicting ideas with the master plan. I'd be interested to hear what conflicting ideas those are.
We're not going to show the whole master plan tonight because it's still kind of sketchy. Part of it is we wanted to get some feedback on the direction we're going before we put all the time into drawing it all up. Yes?
I just wondered if you could orient me, like what that map is showing, or I'm not sure even for which.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's a map from a completely different project.
Okay, so that's why.
Yeah, those are just examples from an earlier show. So another sort of theme beyond the pedestrian spine is generally the open space and greenway activity space network. What we heard from the community is that this is a very high priority. You remember some of you who were with us with the site tour. We spent a lot of time talking about the Vine Brook and can we get a wider greenway behind Macy's? What would that look like? How can we connect to Mary Cummins Park? How can we utilize the parking spaces that are now not being used as open spaces and also protect the rights of the landowners to use those? And people really wanted active gathering spaces, plazas, sidewalks, and cafes, and also sports fields, which it may be a challenge. There's lots of room, but of course that room has a lot of value right now. And so that's what we heard from the community, from property owners. We've seen a lot, and we talked about how there's really high-quality public spaces that have been built in 3rd Avenue, on the district, and other places. So developers see the value of providing these kind of spaces, but they have mixed opinions about incorporating those, especially playing fields. So some of the ideas, again, a regulating plan could designate, as this sample plan from New York State shows, you could actually show where the open spaces should go. And the value of this is that if there's a key spot in the master plan where you want to have a park on a corner or a town square, you have to build it. Whereas if you do 2 or 3, again, the developer landowners can decide where it fits best. It won't necessarily be fitting in perfectly. So number 2, again, is the zoning established a menu of open space types with performance standards. So we typically describe all the different kinds of open space types, and you sort of pick from that menu, but you don't say where they are on a map. And then the vision plan does have them on a map in a sort of preliminary way. This would be great places. And from that vision plan, you have certain principles, like you want to have a town square in the center of an activity node to create a public space where people can gather. You don't want to stick it off in the middle of nowhere. So again, we're sort of leaning toward 2 and 3 as the better balance between sort of having some flexibility and then also getting what the town wants. Yes?
Yeah, just sorry, a little confusion. When you say master plan, are you talking about our town's master plan or the master plan envisioned for this area?
This would be sort of a more detailed version of the vision plan that was done last year, just for the district. So, right, so we'll call it,
That's where the confusion lies.
Planning board's been too long on the master plan.
right, we're redoing the no.
More of a concept.
It's a concept plan or a vision for the district. Right, this is the feedback we need. The frequently asked questions and so on really help us to shape how we're talking about this. Yes?
We have the same pattern on these 3 slides with the regulations, zoning, and vision plan. I mean, we're really focusing for town meeting on zoning, right?
Right.
So are these kind of overlapping?
Yes, well, one of the things we need to
Not the vision plan in general.
one of the things we need to decide is it a good idea to have not just the zoning, but also a vision plan that says this is the kind of thing we really want? Because if you never want to, if you're nervous, well, it would say in the zoning that it would refer to the vision plan, but it wouldn't require you to build it that way, right?
I mean, the regulating plan would basically put all the things that we want to see in the district, or that you want to see in the district, on the zoning map. So Vine Brook, a corridor along the Vine Brook, that certainly would be part of that. You know, maybe connections between different properties to disperse the traffic, and, you know, make it easier for people to get around. That could be part of it as part of a regulating plan, number 1. An alternative to that would be something like have that concept plan, have that overall vision for the district, but tie development, higher level development and maybe mixed use development to certain public benefit improvements that you're going to make on behalf of the town. And that could, again, get to the corridor, the Vine Brook corridor, could be an open space that's publicly accessible or even donated to the town as well. So that's sort of the alternate, is that rather than having, a stringent plan where you typically see in an area that's open up and could be completely developed versus this district, which is pretty well developed. So you're basically giving people options if they're going to redevelop or add new development to get more development through public benefit improvements.
Yes.
I would think that for all of these, if they've been identified as high priorities, then to this gentleman's point, it has to be a combination of all 3 approaches. If there isn't some sort of regulating that says this has to happen, then developer number 1 is going to say, yeah, well, the next guy will do it. So, menu or vision is like, yeah, okay, the next guy will do it. So I think there has to be an aspect of number 1. And if these are the high priorities from the town, then all those 3 things intertwine.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the zoning would require these elements. The difference with number 1 is that they're put on the plan, and you have to adhere to that, as opposed to the zoning saying you must create X percentage of open space and select from these uses. Yeah, well, that'll be the next meeting.
We'll work on that.
So we talked somewhat about so-called low-impact development, green stormwater management, which is basically using natural methods to deal with stormwater rather than just putting it into a pipe. This had broad support in the community, as you might imagine, and also from the property owners. One property owner expressed concern about the overall drainage in the area and the potential flooding from Vine Brook. And so here, our recommendation is to establish performance standards and zoning that would apply to the whole district. Any thoughts about stormwater? Thumbs up. Complete streets. We talked a lot about complete streets. Ted did a wonderful little modeling exercise during the charrette, and this was strongly supported from the community. People want to see sidewalks and some means of getting bicycles through the neighborhood, as well as ever widening lanes for cars. And creating buffers from the sidewalks from the car lanes, because right now, as we found out, a lot of the sidewalks are right next to the speeding cars. It's really, you can walk, but you wouldn't necessarily want to. The other thing we noticed is a lot of the, you can walk along long stretches of Mall Road, but you can't walk from Mall Road necessarily to the mall without crossing the parking lot. So it's, again, something that had wide support in the community, and property owners see that as connections as very important as well. They pointed out, again, that it's difficult to make street connections across property lines, so maybe focus on the pedestrian connections, and then really focus on making the existing streets work first and connect the district that way before you force people to make connections on the interior, which is a fair question. I think you really need to do both. And yes.
So, to give you a bit of background, Vice Chair and Board, there is a lot of feedback that off-street bike paths are desirable. On-street bike paths are not. How do you bring those two ideas together? Because, we're having this extreme opposition about 40A. And 40A is, it's a state road. And there's a lot of confusion again, whether or not it's a planning board or select board issue. How we're going to revive that space. What do you say to those folks as an elected official? What do you say to those folks? Because you can't necessarily have that bike path or bike lane on the day. What do you do here with 50 cars? This is an ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, what we discovered is, what we discovered is, yeah, I mean, it's not an easy design fix. It's basically adopting a policy that says we want to have a continuous sidewalk that people will actually use because it's comfortable, it's not too close to the cars, and it's safe. And we want to have a continuous bike route that's not too close to the cars and is comfortable and is safe. But I think what we discovered looking at the actual district is because there's so much existing development and so many different conditions relative to the width of the streets, the width of the setbacks, and so on, you basically have to thread your way differently depending on where you are within the district. So in some places, there's a broad lawn where if you could build it, within the private part of that setback, there's plenty of room to build a beautiful bike path. But that's a whole nother implementation strategy.
We're talking about two different animals.
Maybe.
When the developer comes to the planning board and says, we have the ability to have this bike path, and, there's plenty of space. This is new space that isn't overdeveloped, or isn't, space that has been like legacy space, so to say. And now, we're third Ave versus 3A. We're talking about two totally different animals. How What do you do?
I think I think as you already have, you identify your overall goals of like where are the destinations people are trying to get to, what are the corridors that we want to have the ability to walk and bicycle, and then you figure out.
Doesn't have control over it, but it's not part of the.
Right, yeah.
I should say Cambridge Street. That's not part of the corridor. I mean, right, yeah, like, this is all wrong.
Well, you raise a really good point, which is while we're doing this vision plan, if we're drawing it all up, or if we're talking about the zoning, we want to make sure that as development happens, it's thinking about those connections and making it possible.
He's gonna have half a town, bike lanes, half a town now.
Yes, you can. A lot of towns do.
We have to.
But then how do you?
Start somewhere.
Sure, you start somewhere, then you can.
Right, the question was, can you have half the town have bike lanes and the other half not?
We start
I think,
That's what cities and towns are.
yeah.
Little bit of cycling by cycle.
We're going to keep moving. Again, the choice is you could have the street layout, not just the existing streets, but future streets, as shown in this plan from Simsbury with the purple. Those are not existing streets, but what the regulating plan has done is say, you will build a street here to create these lovely blocks. And they've determined the width of that, and they have cross sections of each of the street types and so on. And it's on the regulating plan, which means you must do it that way. Again, our recommendation is probably to do a little softer approach where you have we show the list or the range of different street types that people can choose from, essentially, sort of large, medium, and small in different flavors. We have recommended layouts for those where you put the sidewalks and the trees and so on. And then people can choose, and the planning board can use that to review projects. But that basically, it's not required, and they can work it out as they're coming forward with various development plans. And then the vision plan, again, will have cross sections that talk about what the typical streets should be like. I think in the back first.
When you're saying streets, are you talking about actual streets, roadways, subdivision roads? Are you talking about driveways in private developments as well? Are you making a distinction?
It's, well, typically, you know, if you were going to regulate something and you wanted to create something like Third Avenue, which maybe didn't exist beforehand in that format.
Well, Third Avenue is a bunch of public ways or private ways, subdivision streets. throughout.
Right.
But if you're talking about like the internal circulation, Loop Road in the mall, for example, that's not a subdivision road, that is a commercial driveway. So there's some differentiation here. I'm just trying to understand.
Correct. Well, I mean, the concept we talked about a lot at the workshops is that you don't want it to just be a mall road, especially if you're doing infill in those parking lots. You want to create a street that's sort of it may be privately owned, but it feels like a public street with sidewalks and trees and organized circulation. The buildings are fronting on the street. So you're really creating over time more of a town center and less of an internal mall. And the mall is already becoming external, right? There's half a street there. All you need to do is build the roadway and start building stuff on the other side, and you'll have a beautiful sort of a little neighborhood. So that's the concept. And again, the question is how far do you push it in terms of requirements? Many times these kinds of zonings, as shown here, will have the complete street cross-section shown, whether it's existing or proposed, private or public, and say we want to have all of these elements within the streetscape. So we want to have a nice sidewalk, we want to have a place for people to sit down, we want to have a sidewalk and plaza cafe space that's between 10 and 20 feet, and so on. So we can stipulate all those things, but not for particular locations, but just for, if you're doing this kind of development at this density, you should follow this street plan. Yeah.
I'm going to the third point. It feels, especially on this one, that you need some form of regulation. Because if this is all a vision plan and
very much, or they can minimally comply and not really accomplish what you're trying to have accomplished, or, I don't know, and you're putting all the pressure on what the planning board, whoever they are at the time, to be the arbitrator of all of this. So I just feel like I appreciate this subtle nature and people not wanting things crammed down their throats, but I feel like it needs some structure and it needs some, I mean, we're serious about this. So it does need, I think, some level of regulation. You don't want to be onerous, but it needs some level of onerous, which says, here you're out, you have to do one, or you have to do, well, some of the following, but you have to do X, because otherwise the planning board is going to be left with kind of a mess. Or somebody will say, okay, yeah, I'll do it, and then they don't do it, which is kind of what I've seen in some things already, where it looked good when they presented it, and then when it happened, it's not really that.
Right.
And then there's no teeth to follow up and to penalize them for doing that. So I don't know how you reconcile that, but it feels to me like this is too squishy.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just a matter of calibrating the zoning and saying what's required and what's not. So it's great to hear that this should be required. Does anyone disagree?
So to Beth's point, we actually were looking at planning boards and the development of yeah, and we looked at it and said, you know what, some planning board members did not want anything to do with my past, right? And so we're like, okay, well, he wants to come back and forth. And so it's either you need to have a certain regulation or you don't. But again, interpreting one specific area and not in other areas, it's, I think, you know, it's a fine line because people don't want it in one area of town, they want it potentially in other areas of town. And as a same point, how do we integrate one and not the other?
Right. Well, I think it's, you know, a well-designed street goes hand in hand with accommodating higher density. So it's, I think you're requiring a more expensive street with beautiful street trees and sidewalks and on-street parking, whatever it might be, and that's going to cost more money, but you're allowing a higher density, new buildings in those parking lots. So I think it's a very doable sort of quid pro quo when it comes to, again, that balance between what do you require in the regulations and what do you allow to be flexible.
And then if you're doing it right, I mean, ultimately, would you want to connect from maybe Cambridge Street to the mall, so you could actually ride your bike from Cambridge Street to the mall, and ultimately, you want to have a bike path that would connect a lot of, maybe a main thoroughfare for many people.
Yeah. You know, I think particularly as all of these landowners are interested in residential development over time, and that's a tremendous lever to say, well, people need a way to get around beside cars, so if you're going to build your apartments, let's have better bike path, better sidewalks, and so on. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the consistency? I mean, you know, if a developer, the first developer walks in, says, okay, you know, this is, I've chosen this standard of zoning, streets, what have you. And then the second one comes in, and they can choose something else, and I mean, I guess there's some.
They'll all be pretty much, the difference between the different street types is basically a matter of size. So there'll be, and the width of the right-of-way, like Middlesex Turnpike and Burlington Mall Road are both really wide boulevards pretty much now, whereas South Bedford Street is pretty narrow. And so there's an appropriate design for each of those, as well as for private streets like the one in the district and others yet to come. So there'll be a pretty limited list, and they all will respond to the same principles. But again, that's all a set of diagrams that you'll be vetting before it's adopted in the zoning. Yeah.
It strikes me that this is not going to happen like a flick of a switch, property by property, it'll start, and we'll learn through the process. So I guess I'm wondering if we can build in some fluidity so that as we learn from that first project and the second project, we like this, we didn't like that. I mean, is that possible?
Well, I mean, what's often done is you adopt some of it in zoning and some of it in regulations, where zoning has to go to town meeting and the regulations can be approved by the planning board. And I assume there's a way to do that. So Ted's the expert.
Well, I mean, basically you're creating a cross-section, a typical cross-section for major streets like Mall Road and the Turnpike, and then smaller streets like South Bedford or even private roads. And so what you're expected them to do within the right-of-way or within, it's a private street within the area that they're going through the corridor with, you'll have a series of different requirements. And, this is a good example. It's a much more urban example, but you can see, there's travel lanes that are a certain width. There are tree belts, in this case, they're on the sidewalk, but, you'd have a tree belt that separates the travel lanes from the pedestrians on the sidewalk. You'd have a bike lane. There's actually a bike lane shown there on the side of the travel lane. You might have parking as well. So basically, you'll have all these different components that are part of the different types of streets, public and private. And then there'll be additional standards for beyond the right-of-way, because in some cases, we just don't have the room within the right-of-way to do the things that we want to do. So you're basically trying to create, multi-mobility in a way that encloses the street, creates, sort of a lively, a mode of transportation for all different types of vehicles and bicycles, as well as trying to, on the edge of the right-of-way, provide some activation of the sidewalk.
So can all of that, should all of that be in zoning, the base zoning document, or can some of it be done as regulations?
I think we start in the base zoning, and then we sort of refine it and figure out what, whether we want to keep it in there or whether we want to take out part of it or all of it. But I think it's important to have an idea or, sort of an opportunity to sort of, envision changes on our major corridors as well as our minor corridors and our private developments. I mean, Third Avenue is great. I mean, that's got, on-street parking, it's got sidewalks, it's got street trees. I don't think it's got bike lanes, but it's got, it's very friendly, and it's very, it's attractive. It's easy for people to get around that. There's no reason we can't have that in different parts of this district.
And then we talked a lot about what kind of redevelopment would happen, what uses are allowed, and Ted will get more into our recommendations for that. The community, generally, people seem to be open for redevelopment, a variety of uses. They want to ensure that existing uses remain viable, and that whatever we do sort of supports and enhances the economic value of the mall and the office parks, and maintain the regional destination clusters like the mall and the office parks, as well as the hospital. There is a lot of concern, as you hear every year, probably at town meeting, about impacts of development on traffic and school children. And again, that's something that when we discuss where to set the limits on how big an area gets zoned for housing, that factors into it. But also we heard that the town needs housing. I mean, this is something in every community we're struggling with. We don't want housing, but we need it. I mean, what we don't want is to lose our open space and to have more traffic, but we desperately need to have housing for our children and our parents and ourselves. And a lot of that is what the so-called missing middle type of housing between the big single-family houses and the giant shoebox apartments. So how can we incentivize developers to build more the kind of neighborhood housing that's a little higher density, the townhouses and the smaller apartment buildings and so on. And then to keep those uses as varied, but also in balance with what's there. And then we heard over and over again, to maintain the town's fiscal health, support the tax base, and so on. Property owners are, as we know, very interested in redeveloping the underutilized parking. They want to have a mix of uses that support each other, but they, as we heard, feel like the existing zoning needs to be more flexible. Everyone wants to have residential, well, pretty much, maybe not everybody, but we heard a lot of support for residential uses. There's a lot of interest in continuing the development of lab and life sciences uses, and making projects allowed by right, so that they have the predictability to get funding and actually build the thing. to purchase a property and know what you're entitled to do without a mysterious or unpredictable, not mysterious, but an unpredictable process of review and approval. So what we heard about housing is that there was a lot of potential for a residential space, particularly if you go to the kind of development that people seem to like, which is the 4, 5, 6-story apartments along the streetscape with trees and so on. And so we did a lot of modeling. People seem to be comfortable with using the new development, the new apartment blocks particularly, to help sort of enclose the streets and make them active, walkable, and interesting. There's also an opportunity to fulfill the MBTA community housing requirements that you're under, which is something like, 1,000 units?
So we need to prove to the state that we have a zoning district that will allow the potential for 1,043 units. Whether we don't have to ever reach that goal, but we have to do some math and prove to the state that our zoning allows for that.
Which at 15 units an acre is 75 acres, something like that. It's not a big part of.
Yeah.
At this point in time, we don't have So we can utilize some of the existing multifamily sites in town, but I think that this provides a really good opportunity to kind of kill two birds with one stone. That you can use, all 50 acres don't need to be in this district. Some of it, we have 25 acres here, 25 acres there. But I think that, again, I want to take a hybrid approach. The town's done a lot for multifamily housing, been very progressive in that instance. So, credit where credit is due. And some of that overlay should be on existing multifamily. And the rest, I think, would do really well in this district to support all of these new uses that we want to allow this new development and infill, and to really create a vibrant place in our commercial district.
Yes.
So, 2 points. One is, in this area, we already have Seven Springs, which has a number of multifamily housing units in it. So we should find out how many there are specifically. So that okay.
I have all this.
So, no, I'm just saying, so that we know that we don't, if we're going to use this to help that we're already this far along and that PTA number. But that was one point. The other is, I just want to challenge a little bit. You said, at least in terms of the meetings I've been in, I've been hearing more support, not big box things, or like 6 stories in these areas. A lot of that 6 stories are a little bit big box. So I was hearing a lot more support for the lower profile kind of units for which combine both apartments and condos, living for folks. So you said, that the consensus was like something 6 stories. I just want to challenge that because that is not at all what I heard. So I just want to throw that out.
Yeah,
Charlotte was, today, at this point in time, the existing multifamily number we have in the community, how are we meeting guidelines, or are we falling short, or where do we stand? Currently, we don't have any zoning that allows for multifamily by right, but if we use what we have for multifamily zone, we adhere to the MBTA zoning requirements.
Yeah, this,
Like, I'm just saying, it doesn't necessarily have to be that, it just has to be rezoned.
yeah, but the state has established a pretty rigorous sort of review process, so it has to be within a reasonable possibility that they actually would do it. So you can't like just,
We can't count rivers, we can't count the reservoir, it has to be upland area. I'm asking these questions because people don't. Yes, without, no examples. Exactly, no, yes.
We come to next week.
Yep.
The rug has to be allowed by right.
Yes, that's correct. Yep, that's correct.
And this does not have to be a certain distance within the MBTA group.
So for our community, it does not, because we are only a bus community. For communities with a commuter rail and subway, it has to be within a certain distance of those stops. But because we don't have bus lines, it doesn't. It just so happens that most of the areas that I think would be appropriate for this type of development are on bus lines. No, not just by the nature, on existing bus lines, just by the nature of kind of where this type of redevelopment makes the most sense, I think.
so here's some of the sort of the options for how you rearrange redevelopment within these new zoning districts, if that's what we do. So one option is to just allow more uses by right everywhere. And this would sort of loosen up the existing requirements, allow people everywhere to build everywhere in the district to build parking garages. Right, so within this district, allow everybody to build parking garages, say, and do some other things that would enhance economic opportunity. Second option is to allow residential at a low density throughout the whole district, and perhaps have a special permit for additional density. So then the question is, what's low density? Is it 15 units an acre, which is basically more of a townhouse density, really? Or is it 5 units an acre, and then, as you do now, they have to do traffic mitigation to get more or something. And then the third, which we're leaning toward, is to have residential by right in the areas where you want to focus activity and encourage mixed-use development and the liveliness that goes along with it. And to do that at the 15 units an acre, to find 50 acres that you can rezone, but do it focused on the key nodes around the mall and around the south end of South Bedford Street, at the Wayside Plaza and the Wayside Office Park, and to have a special permit for additional density beyond the 15 units an acre, and then as an alternative to have a special permit for residential elsewhere in the study area or the base district. So we're sort of leaning toward that. Both the first option is to sort of open up the uses by right everywhere, and then focus the residential in the mixed-use nodes where you want to have that activity. And this is a question that I can't answer for you.
I guess I have a definite bias against, I think we need to get the right density. I'm not sure the MBTA density definition is what we're here. So I don't know that answer, but.
You think it should be higher or lower? If it's by right.
I just, the ones that I have seen that are talking about defined lists tend to be more, blocks of house, it doesn't look neat, it doesn't look like a community, it looks like a 1950s, I don't know, Middle Eastern.
Right.
Like a government center, right? It's like, no. So I guess, I'm not sure what of these would allow us to have it be more, maybe 3 stories, maybe a combination of 3 stories and 2 townhouses, kind of mixing it up, maybe a little bit more, so it looks more like a community, which is kind of how the direction I thought we might want to go in based on some of the discussions to make it, this area look like a community, not like the Avalon Woburn, which is this big block that just is stuck there.
Right.
And I'm not sure how you get there from doing what you're doing now.
Well, it would be focusing that community building in these nodes. So for example, if you're developing in the parking lots around the mall, you would establish a grid of attractive streets, and then you would fill in the blocks with different densities of housing, which could range from townhouses to 3-story apartments to taller apartments.
That could be rezoned, right? That was something you emphasized in the previous meetings, was height constriction.
Right.
And so that could obviously be put into what, 6 floors, 103, that's what
Right.
The kind of question I have is kind of more of a design question, and I think that working here, I feel like people want kind of more colonial looking, traditional style housing, but then also I think about the Microsoft building by Wayside and having a traditional townhome style development next to a big glass office building. Does that make sense?
Well, I think there's
Like, I wonder if it's in the middle ground.
There definitely is the middle ground. It doesn't need to be a box. You can have, we have some nicely designed multifamily houses, units in this town now. And I mean, this is all subjective, right? So what I think is really nicely communities. So, but,
Well, you can,
But I think there's two points where you say, you know, this local structure here, and you say, let's good for one generation, like, not good together. I mean, I think there's an opportunity, but we know where corporate structures are going to be. If they're looking at, saying, we need 25 to 2 acres, in one specific area, why are we saying, you know what? People really don't want this excess housing, all the traffic, and all this, everything that comes with it. Why are we saying, okay, 25 to 50 acres, let's put it in a corporate structure area where these big buildings, like science buildings, results can go both ways. And now we don't have to worry about all this additional housing. But maybe there's the curtails of that area that could be additional housing. I think it needs to kind of invest in the words, because if we can, we're going to want to push back from, we don't want additional traffic, we don't want additional housing. Our resources are low as it stands right now. We're using more schools. There's a lot of impacting factors that come in when we have additional housing and additional population. We're not little roads anymore. We're Arlington, Cambridge, we're moving into a different genre of what our community is going to.
It's also funny, I always find discussion of housing, everyone's like, we need more housing, but I don't want all the stuff that can put it. I don't want the people that are driving. It's always like funny that.
Yeah, as,
Well, I think that there's a, you can find, that we can talk about this stuff in terms of what's the reality. How many kids are in the school, how many school bus kids get on the bus up at the Fremont and all of those, right? I mean, we have, there's a lot of data that shows that probably a lot of the housing that would be developed may or may not, you guys know, if you do it this way, you're gonna get favors, if you do it that way, you're not, kind of thing.
Because
So-
also, just to add, but also maybe that impact traffic, and especially in schools within age restricted. There are some developments which can restrict the age of that housing. So in order to help to develop, we have to go to that real situation afterwards.
It is a solution, it won't.
Or not solution, maybe like it could be like indicate whatever is needed.
first get some agreement on this general idea, and then the map is what that result is. So thanks. So in general, what our recommendation is sort of is a result of, we've been hearing what you've been saying from the beginning, which is people are really nervous about too much housing. And no one's quite sure exactly where to start, but probably the MBTA zoning with 1,040.
Well, I mean, so we're doing a form-based code here. So you're allowing it by right, but then by its nature, it's going to have some design requirements.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right, so it's not like, I think I would imagine that it would give us a little bit more control over kind of how it will kind of look and be, and kind of, that type of thing.
Right.
Is that-
Yeah, and we'll get back into show you more examples and talk about how you control that and so on. I mean, if you think about any wonderful city street that you've walked down, often you can't remember the architecture because what you focus on is that sidewalk experience and what's happening on the ground floor. And you don't really notice if it's a 2-story building or an 8-story building unless it's looming right over you. So a really nicely designed neighborhood at any scale has a mix of different housing types to give it that neighborhood feeling like you're talking about. But to make this economically viable, it's going to have to start at a larger floor, a larger floor of density than the typical neighborhood in Burlington. Otherwise, nobody's going to build anything. But I mean, the 15 units an acre is not a high density, and that's basically, you could do townhouses. You could even do that with cottages. We've seen that done. Not that anybody's going to build that, but it's, townhouses and 3-story apartments gets you to 15 units an acre. And then the larger sort of shoeboxes we see all over, good or bad, in terms of design, are more like 20 and 30 units an acre. So again, you could have, set it fairly low to start with, and then have design controls in the code that help to create a wonderful street experience that makes everything else work. Yeah.
Talking about the possibility of additional families and children and things, do the MBTA communities requirements mandate 3-bedroom apartments, or is it just units?
You cannot exclude family units. You can't make it all age restricted.
But you could build nothing but 1-bedroom apartments, or 2-bedroom apartments.
I don't believe you can stipulate that.
I don't think you can stipulate it in the zoning.
Okay.
I mean, just by the nature of what we've had built in the past, most of these, so, since, for the past, 18, 20 years, we've built 2,000 units. Most of those are 1 and 2-bedroom units, a couple of 3-bedrooms, and the majority of those units that we built, we have like 57 kids coming out of all of those 2,000 units in the school systems.
Yeah, I just want to add that it's very unusual to get, 3 bedrooms or more units. I mean, if you look at like the 40R program, the Smart Growth Overlay District, and you look at all the communities that have done development over the last 10 years, it's a very small fraction that's more than 2. On average, it's 1, 1.5, but mostly, that's the limit. It doesn't get any higher. So people are really looking, really sort of an opportunity for people to either, sell a big house and get into a small unit, or a couple that are just starting out, have the money for a single-family home, but they want to get a foothold in the community. So we're seeing a lot of going to
the affordable housing area. They say one of the biggest needs is 3-bedroom affordable housing for families that are in need.
Yeah.
So, that's another thing that's something I could be able to consider.
So it will be considered because we do have a mandate in town that if you need to 15%, if you have a multifamily building, 15% of that needs to be affordable. So by building these units, it will automatically contribute to affordable units within the town themselves. So it's not a perfect system, but it will create more affordable units within the towns. 15% of the total units, not a majority of them, by any means. Yeah, it takes only 10% and we're getting into the weeds. I'm gonna fight for 15 because people need to be able to afford to live here.
So,
I keep hearing about traffic, it's like, it would be interesting to know, like in Huntington or whatever the other one is, what percentage of those people used to drive from Burlington, but now they live there, and they walk down the street, or they hop on their bike, and they take cars off them.
So I feel this, Todd Fremont Smith and Gordon, who developed those, told me that
Yeah, and then now that we're hopefully getting beyond the COVID years, I think developers are getting back into sort of meeting town desire to reduce traffic. And part of this sort of special permit opportunity, as you do now, is to have traffic mitigation in return for more density. So you can build more units if you establish a shuttle to the train station or whatever it might be that gets people out of their cars. So, it's an opportunity, as you say, to bring people in who are going to work in this district. You have 10,000 jobs, right, within the study area. The hospital is interested in building some workforce housing.
I've heard rumors that they're interested in it, but when you think about, not 90% of the people that work in the hospital are not making six figures. And they're the biggest, they're the largest employer in town, and I think, there's a lot of traffic coming in, people who are working for teachers, assistants, whatever, they have to live far away, all that stuff. So,
Was that part of the next school too, or is that just for their employees?
I don't know. It's so preliminary. It's rumors. I don't know. I know. I can't. It's either confirmed or denied.
You're on tape. We got the tape.
So does everybody agree that some housing is appropriate?
Yes.
And is there a general consensus that this approach of sort of focusing the housing on two nodes makes sense?
Can you just remind me, those are long and the dark paint on that?
Kind of the sort of South Bedford Street, Wayside area south of the highway.
I think I have a problem with South Bedford Street. Traffic for sure, because we all the roads in there, and that does get down to 3A issues. So we have to be very, very, very careful on that particular one. The other, I think, is probably going to be much easier. And again, the park is there on South Bedford Street, which the park, the athletic fields and stuff like that. I think we just need to be very careful with that part of the town.
Well, it seems like that's a more logical spot for the smaller scale housing, right? Adjacent to the park, adjacent to other residential neighborhoods, would maybe allow people to build up to a certain level, encouraging something that's not quite as tall.
Well, I think you should introduce that traffic is through the corporate village right there. So the idea would be this look like we redeveloping that area, so we might not be adding additional traffic.
The traffic is not coming from that other zone. The traffic is coming, it's kind of traffic. It's coming from other places. That's not the problem.
But it's always concentrated around,
Right, it's coming down.
so it's
It's
down.
down.
So who else?
Oracle, you got all those little things coming out on the Blanchard Road. Letting people, it's a cut through to get to market basket, it's a cut through to get to the, it's not, Microsoft's not a problem, there are no cars there, nobody lives there. I guess they do this and stuff like that, but that is not, and those people, they go right out of the building, there's an exit right there, goes right on to Wayside Road and right to Highway. So those people are not blocking up South Bedford Street or Blanchard.
Wasn't that what people were doing, they live there too? Or right on Wayside or something?
That was one of the things we discussed at the workshop, is that there's really easy access onto the highway from that area.
Not either side of Wayside Road, that's you're creating housing there where you're making the assumption that everyone's going to farm. Not only that, because the other node, people who could live in there possibly do not farm.
Right.
Because everything's right there. So that creating housing is just creating more cars. Versus the other housing, that was my issue between the two, is one is creating housing that will everybody want a car or two, and the other one possibly could do that car home. So
That's a good point.
so the one on the left, to me, is, don't need a car there, right? Do everything there. The other one, and to your point, actually, anybody who wants to go towards Winchester has to get out of line to something. They want to go to Market Basket, they have to go to Blanchard Road. So you're not going people, it's not like going home. It's a different, you're living there, and it's a
Mhm.
And I live in that neighborhood,
Yeah.
and Dave does too. So we know that traffic really well, and we know that area really well. The other one to me is a slam dunk, yes, absolutely. That one, I really love.
Yeah.
Understood. We're going to keep moving. What we heard from the community about parking is that there's general recognition that there's a lot of underutilized asphalt, and that structured parking, as demonstrated by the number of garages that have been built, is okay. For property owners, we heard that parking ratios are probably a little excessive, and they would like also to have the opportunity to make better use of underutilized parking. I mean, what we discovered, like I did a study of a number of properties like 25 Burlington Mall Road, and it's basically to build, they're at the 0.5 FAR that's allowed on that site with that 5 or 6 story building, and the parking that's there, which basically covers everything, is what's required to service that level of development. So in order to redevelop that site and replace the parking lots with something nice, they would have to build a parking garage. So the question is, what's the incentive for them to do that at $50,000 a space or whatever it is these days, to build a garage? So,
But doesn't that presume that people are still going back to work and not working from home here?
that's, yes. So, yeah, if those buildings are abandoned with vines growing out of the sidewalks, we'll have to have another planning process. Yeah.
Parking ratios entirely under control by the town, is that?
Yes.
So we can make that interpret as we want.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, a lot of towns, especially with downtowns, they're eliminating parking requirements because the developers will put in the parking they need, or they'll do it when they need it. So you don't really, there's nobody going to build a building that their customers or tenants can't park if they need to. Yeah.
Why are we calling it underutilized? It's exactly right size for the existing building.
It's not right-sized for the building. It's the size you have to build according to the zoning.
So the zoning needs to change.
Correct. That's what we're talking about. You have the control over the amount of parking that's required per the size of the building. And as I said, a lot of towns have just eliminated that. Of course, a lot of towns have public transit and other things that make that work easier. Yeah.
Just to, I agree, we own a number of office buildings, the parking's not being fully utilized, but many of the buildings that we've built we've had to max out the current zoning, because that's what the requirements are for the companies that move in there and the expected use. So we usually see a 3 to 3.5 per thousand parking spaces per 3 to 3.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of office building. That is clearly not the case these days. However, we don't know, no one knows what that's going to be like in 3 years, never mind 5 or 10 from now. And if you have a parking requirement that becomes significantly out of line with what's happening in the marketplace, then we exclude ourselves from being able to attract those users. Office, we already see there's a battle for Mondays now. Should people come back to work on Mondays? And where there are going to be more people in the office, it seems like there's a little bit that means there's going to be a need for an increased use of the parking that's out there. And I don't know how this is, I don't know where that's going to be, but in 3 years, 5 years from now, if office space is more attractive because people need and want, or companies are requiring it, whatever the reason is, to go back to the office, and we have zoning in place that does not allow for that flexibility, we're going to be unable to attract that type of use. And I think an office is still an attractive type of use if the demand is there.
Sure.
We should be very careful if we look at our parking ratios. With the Woodland Mall, they're already not enough parking there. It's a beautiful brand new facility where surface and everything, that I don't even want to go there. All those places are new, so just we have to be careful with messing with it too much. But I understand the use of kind of better, like, honing in on a better ratio to maximize
Ted will talk a little bit more about shared parking and other things, but basically you want to bring the standards up to what we've learned from the last 20 years as defined by the Institute of Traffic Engineers and others, and then to allow structured parking everywhere so that they have that as an option. Does anybody disagree with that? All right. Building design. We'll go a little quicker.
Peter, just check my time, because I know you folks told me that they may have to leave. Could you just give us a little bit of sense how many more slides, and then
How many did you have?
A lot. What time is it?
it's 8 right now?
Oh, it's 8 right now? Why don't we just hit the key points? I mean, you've only had the parking, the zoning for a day now, so maybe the best thing for us to do is just briefly go over that quickly after, Peter's done with his presentation. And then the next meeting, you have a chance to review it in much more detail and get into the nitty-gritty and figure out what you like and what you don't like.
Right. So here's an example of a building that people always like, no matter when we show it. This is a Union Studio architecture building in Providence. But what it has, it's a pretty big building, but it has a scale that feels more like a residential building because they've lined up those eaves up against the road. But generally what we heard is that somewhere between 4 and 6 stories people are pretty comfortable with, that the design preferences that people have and the height of the buildings should be adjusted depending on where you are in the district, and that could be part of the plan. And then what we heard from property owners, that they want the flexibility to respond to different uses. And then a lab building is not going to have beautiful peaked roof and a lot of glass. So the future question to talk about is how do we accommodate those kind of uses? How do you design a parking garage? How do you design a lab building? And it may be more about where do we put that within a development proposal? We heard there's a mix here, but some of the ones with more green dots, which are favorable, versus red dots, which were like, we don't want to see this. There's more green dots on the buildings that are 4 to 6 stories, that have a lot of what we call articulation, and that the building is broken up into different wings. It feels more like the scale of other buildings in Burlington, and people didn't really like the 12-story one by the Natick Mall, I think that is. And then I think there is a mix opinion about, certainly in the office parks, does this have to look like a quaint little back bay building? Can we have something that's dynamic and exciting? And maybe the people who work in those labs and office parks would really like to live there. And can it be worse than looking at the back end of the garage from Blanchard Street? Another question. So the options, again, a sort of a full form-based code will organize the zoning code by building types and say you must build this kind of building with particular dimension and design standards. Another option is to establish basic design standards for the buildings with a focusing on the massing and the relationship to the public realm. And then partly because we don't know enough about what the market is and what the demand is, it's hard to say you must build a particular type of building. Plus there's so many, as we're just saying, so many different areas within this that we really can't, I wouldn't be able to tell you what you should build in each of those districts necessarily. But what we can do is establish basic massing and height for each area, and to have standards that basically require the developers to work with architects to build a building that we'd like to see, and not something that we need to turn away from, whatever that is. Does anybody disagree with that conclusion? All right. Flexibility versus predictability, both and. That's what we're after. So zoning changes. As you can see, we've done this draft zoning map, and it's basically the same side. But basically, it's taking the entire study area, which is shown the light pink and the dark pink together. Basically, everything that we've been looking at becomes part of a new base district, the 128 Innovation Zone, or whatever we're calling it. And then within that, there are separate sub-districts around the mall shown in pink, and around South Bedford Street, which is where you would allow housing. And this is sort of a starting point. And then within those, one of the concepts is this dash line shows areas where you would require active frontage uses. And Ted will talk more about that, but basically you want something that's an attractive place, not just to look at, but also to be. So active uses like storefronts or uses that are related to residential, and not necessarily storefronts, but like the gym and office space that's catering to people who live in the neighborhood, those kind of things that, invite people to walk up and down and actually give people a reason to walk up and down those streets. So this is one option for where those might be along the existing frontage, and then the frontage of South Bedford Street, and then we'll talk more about exactly how that gets arranged. Reaction?
Thoughts? Yes.
The light purple is sort of that base district where you're not allowing residential, but you're applying similar kind of design standards to streets and to landscaping and that idea of we want you to make the pedestrian connections. So all of that sort of basic design standards would apply everywhere. And then within the dark pink would be where you would allow residential, at least to start with.
But in your plan is everywhere where there's color there? And look specifically at the Middlesex Turnpike south of 128, in dark purple.
Oh, that's not what
See,
we're.
yeah.
Those
Sorry.
are the innovation
No.
districts, that's a separate zone, that's not within this heavy zone area.
Yeah, sorry, if you're not familiar with the existing zoning, the yellow, orange colors are the planned development districts that exist. The dark purple and sort of medium purple are the industrial innovation, industrial general districts as they exist today. And the red are the business districts as they exist today. So we're sort of changing the base just for the study area and leaving everything else alone. Though there's an option to say, well, why wouldn't we want to extend this to other areas, at least the base zoning? That's a question for you. That first.
We were talking before about life science. So what would that be? The pink also?
Yeah, throughout the whole new innovation district, it would have the same base uses.
And those
Which
are,
we could talk about life sciences and so on. Well, you're going to talk about that.
Well, if we have time, yeah, but basically anything that's in the purple or the darker purple, it's basically all the uses would be allowed. Some of them would be allowed by special permit, but a lot of them, like lab, would be allowed. The idea is that we're taking the study area, which is a sort of a patchwork of different industrial and commercial districts now, and turn that into an overall district where we do have a mix of commercial industrial uses, but in certain specific areas where it's appropriate, we would allow mixed use, meaning a residential with a commercial component. And what you probably can't see it very well, but the striped areas along these areas where you're allowing mixed use, down here in South Bedford here, what that means is that on those corridors, we want to make sure that there's some ground floor commercial use. We want to make sure that it's active, it's engaging, it's vibrant, and plus, that's the best place for businesses to succeed with the traffic volumes and the visibility. So if you're doing residential, you can do it on top of that at the true mixed-use building, or you could do horizontal mixed use and setting back the residential part of it 100 feet or so. So again, we're trying to maintain the opportunities for business development on the main corridors, but again, it's allowing some level, which we have to decide, of mixed use, including a residential component.
Good question. Comment?
There was more of a thought with regard to what Liz said and housing, workforce housing, and Lakey. Any consideration for putting, in the central area where Lakey is, that big massive land back there, if they're contemplating it, would we be excluding them from doing it?
Currently, we would. This is a brand new thing. We didn't hear about this till just this week. So, So that's something for us.
That nice big chunk of land
Right.
back there that.
Yeah, and they do have a lot of land in the back where they could do that. And, again, that would,
Not change the color on your track.
well, maybe the thing to do, well, let's talk about this more, and maybe not tonight, but, in future sessions. But maybe we can allow residential by special permit in the greater area with a series of design standards and other conditions, so that could be a possibility at Leahy.
This is a question. I know that universities, like, produce can do whatever they want, whenever they want.
That's a plan development, yeah. Well, they have a master plan.
Well, I mean, they don't.
She's talking about the Dover Amendment, I think. I think
Oh.
they're talking about the Dover Amendment.
Oh.
Because of Northeastern, I know regional stuff. But the Dover Amendment means that any nonprofit educational use and religious institutions, they're all, you can't restrict zoning anywhere. So next door to Sherry, Church of Philip, you can stop it. So that they, yes.
So Leahy, because of that, and they're a nonprofit, they can build housing there if they wanted to, anyhow, even without
If
this.
they consider, they can prove that they are, if their mission is an educational institution,
Medical school,
maybe.
I'm just thinking that they may be able to do it anyhow, so we might as well just.
We should probably find out.
We should probably get to talk
Yeah,
about
yeah.
But we should anticipate that.
Yeah, like Leahy and housing and workforce housing.
Yeah.
We have talked about that.
And there was one question of, do we carve out Leahy entirely and just leave them in the existing zoning?
We had a lot of
Like
them.
we did with
yeah.
the planned development districts. So that's a question.
Well, there's other things they might want to do there in addition to the hospital and housing that they'd probably be pretty restrictive on right now. They'd also, they wouldn't benefit by the structured parking standards we're putting together as well, so.
They are allowed to have structured parking as it is, because they
As
have
it-
parking structure. There was a special distance, like there was a zone, something happened, so they could have more parking. It's something that they're not here right now, so I think it's something that we should, maybe kind of reach out to them specifically and say, hey, but I don't know, what is their overall estimate, right?
Was the medical school qualified with Leahy as a Dover?
I don't know, I would have to dig into that a little bit more. I know religious institutions and like schools.
They're not putting UMass Medical School.
Right. So,
Agricultural, religious, and educational uses.
yeah, so I think, I mean, I have to look into
Run through your
this more.
slides,
I want to
just show
have
them
that.
what you sent them.
Yeah,
What time is
like,
After, I guess.
it? What's that?
Yeah, we have to listen to it. We may not have gave it a little time.
yeah.
It's 8:10.
Day 10?
This has been great. Ted has some more details.
Well, I'm,
20 minutes.
So,
There.
yeah,
But also this
Okay.
is, you sent
this is a
Some
continued
draft.
conversation.
now you basically, one of the first things we did when we started working on the zoning was to look at the table of use. For us, that and the parking standards were the two things we heard most in terms of things that need to be addressed in this overall district. So we got into the table of use, and what we did is we kept it the same, except for what we did is we added a new column for the business, the Burlington 128 Innovation District. That's what we're calling it now. It's going to be up to you folks to see what you want to call it in the end. But basically what we did is we took the 4 districts that are currently in the study area, which includes the general business, general industrial, innovation, and industrial retail. Yeah, interesting. And we went through that whole series of what's allowed and what's not allowed and what's allowed by special permit. And we basically took the highest common denominator. So if it was a yes or it was a no all the way across the board, we said no or possibly a special permit. If it was mostly yes or all yes, we said yes. If it was a mix of yes and special permit, we said either yes or special permit. So basically carried it over into the new district to start with. And again, as far as what's allowed in in this new district is, we're going to have to go through this line by line to determine what you're comfortable with and what you're not, whether it's allowed by right, whether it's allowed by special permit. The other thing we want to make sure we do as part of this process is we want to make sure that all of the existing use terms, the different uses you have on the table, as well as the new ones that we're adding to it, are properly defined. There's a lot of things in the table itself where it says, for example, a professional office, including but not necessarily excluding. You really need a good definition for a lot of these, whether it's in there today or whether it's something new that we're adding to it. So that would go back in the definition section. And as well as that, we want to look at, when there is a situation where there's a potential conflict between a new development and an existing development, we want to make sure that they are addressed by special regulations. And you have a couple of different articles set up for residential special conditions and then non-residential. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be adding new standards for that to make sure that we make sure it's a good high-quality development as well as it's protecting its neighbors from any potential impact. So this is the.
What's the new, sorry?
Oh, go ahead.
The new blue column there? I can't read it.
I know.
Give us a big
You're going to have to go home and read it on your screen. I wasn't expecting this venue would be presenting zoning, but basically it's the new district we're talking about, the one that Peter pointed out on the map over there.
So for those who have never read a zoning use table before,
Oh, it's fun.
the left is all of the different uses, so like Barber and Taylor and, bed and breakfast is on the left of the uses, and then all of those separate columns are the zoning districts that they're either allowed in, not allowed in, or need a special permit for. And so what Ted has done is he's combined in the red box with VGI, GI, and IR, he's kind of looked at those and said, okay, we want all of those districts exist in the West 28 district. What do we think makes the most sense to allow for in this new district zoning? And he created the blue column. Does that help?
You're eliminating the other ones?
Nope.
No.
Keeping them.
No, we keep them.
The town still has.
That's right, they still exist outside the boundaries. Right.
So, question, how is it going to work out with the overlay restrictions like you have, for example, right? Let's say that you allow residential and so I can do the signs in one district. So how does it work with overlay restrictions?
We-
Let's say,
We haven't decided whether it'd be an overlay or a base district. At this point, it would be a new base district. Yeah, but again, that's another big discussion we need to have down the road, is whether it should be an overlay or whether it should be a base
But
district.
as far as like aquifer and water resources, and they're water sources, so I think it's a lot, I think a lot of them take precedent. Certain uses will allow, certain uses won't.
Yeah.
Depending upon what happens.
Right, right.
It's more for kind of public health, more than anything.
But
Right.
then, yeah, but then I assume that at the moment, of course, the use and every location will be different. Also, for the next time, it's worked out with the life safety level, maybe just
Oh, yeah.
two.
Oh, yeah,
maybe
we
only
already
base and
have
aquifer, I think it'll be worked out.
Yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have replaced right there, that would not be replaced. We're gonna have a new category.
No, I'm just putting it there. I mean, ultimately, it would go,
No, those need to stay, AG, IG.
oh, no, they are staying, I'm sorry.
Right, but you have to replace with 128 districts, so that's confusing.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It's basically,
So I would just leave that as it is, and just add a new.
right, right. This is only
And
a,
that's where you base your decision
Correct.
on whether it's
Right,
yes, no,
right.
whatever goes.
yeah, keep in mind, this is just a preliminary draft, and it's really for your benefit to sort of start to think about what do you think is appropriate there and what scale and what additional uses we might want to add.
In general, does that approach make sense, that highest common denominator?
Just as a starting point.
Yeah, well, we'll have to go through it line by line and figure out,
And we should all be providing the definitions.
yes, yes, yeah, working on them now. Yep,
So,
yep.
yeah, I mean, part of the approach was to look at the existing zoning. So, right, if we had a map of the existing zoning, I don't know if we have that slide yet, essentially through the 500 acres, we
have the BG, IG, I, and IR. So this was a patchwork or quilt work of all of those. The BG being probably the biggest here that had not significantly been updated since the 60s. And so the uses and some of the things that are in here have been limiting. So if we're going to revisit it, I think that's where Ted is trying to say, we're trying to aggravate what's been going on here already. So we're bringing that together. And then we're trying to incorporate the mixed use in the housing piece in the hot pink areas. And that is kind of give that node sense and maintain the activation. To what degree and density becomes, this is our conversation at the go. Or if this is not the approach and we want to look at very low density do the other thing, those are some of the options that he's explaining. We'll send the slide deck back. You'll have time to digest this. This is our first meeting on it with more, real detail to it than we've discussed before. But maybe that kind of gives some context of how he was thinking of a place is really an aggregating of what's been going on here. And that's kind of what we're thinking of. And to some degree, town meeting's already done this. That's why you had the innovation district or the IR, what we would have worked on. And that was looking to put the life science into some of the industrial zone. And then if you recall, town meeting members, we've had more interest in getting to that IR zone, right? Several people wanted to be in that IR zone because it had a little more flexibility. So what we've seen is a pattern here is what can work. And now we're trying to put some more control and guidance on that. So we're not just having another patchwork of, we're calling it now industrial innovation district. But we're really, let's give this some thought. And then what Ted was also saying, they're yet to be named. We can really give this definition in our commercial, hub here.
Right, could be a branding opportunity.
Yeah, really branding opportunity, really express what we want to see here.
Melissa, would it be fair to say that the form-based zoning that we're going to put it together is for those hot pink areas and not the rest of it? Right? Or no?
Well, no,
I'll just say from my understanding, and we've talked a lot about this, because I initially looked at it as a form-based code. And the form-based has the regulating plan, which Ted was talking about, which is very much more prescriptive. This is where things should go, this is what we want, and that's it. What we've been talking about, and what I think our consultants have been trying to say, is maybe we want a little bit more flexibility and a little less prescription, and there's different ways you can do that. But so I say form-based code, and the strictest, so it has a little spec in the strictest approach will be very regulated. You can't deviate from it, and it would be regulated in all those initial components he said at the beginning. Street, open space, building design, very restricted. Now, if we can move it to maybe a middle zone, it's still kind of a form-based code. There's still emphasis on design and what the community wants to invest in. Open spaces, stormwater, nature-based solutions in areas like that. Those are important. We all agree to those at the beginning, and that's been a consistent theme. So maybe how can we kind of make those a little bit more anchored in is what I've been thinking of as we've been talking about it.
Yeah.
So, as much as I can advise our whole group, we've been talking about form-based code, but it is a little bit more malleable than I think we all maybe went into it initially thinking. So if that's helpful.
Yeah.
I know my thinking around it has been evolving as well, because we still want to encourage the development and not make it so onerous or so detailed that we lose the creativity and incentive for our development that we want to see.
We want to encourage innovation.
Right.
Architecture.
Right.
Innovation in landscape design, that's something really cool.
Right. Good.
I think in one of the slides earlier, you looked at flexibility and predictability. We're getting closer to it. I do like the fact that you used the higher average to define what was going to be allowed. But this is pushing, some nodes in the special permit. It's really what's the next step there. Special permit. You say special permit, and it's like, where it's starting to get narrowed down to a plan. But that's where it's really going to be, this is going to want to know, what does it take to get a special permit?
Right.
Last
So,
time we did that.
well,
How many people apply for it?
so,
Only the ones who apply for it know that they can get it.
well, part of the process is that we would have planning board rules and regulations, design standards and guidelines, which would be addressing the special permit process. So that whether it was residential, or commercial, or mixed use, there'd be good design standards, not only for the building themselves, but the development. You know, are they integrating active and attractive open spaces that people can actually utilize? Are they, you know, using sustainable design? Are they using, are they fulfilling sort of the basic design standards they have in the buildings? It's all sort of a complete process and standards that, you know, will guide the planning board and make decisions on special permits.
Right, we heard from them tonight saying that they want those tools. They want
Yeah,
to know what
right.
definition.
And it'll help the developer, but it also will help the planning board through the process. That's really what we're after.
There are elements you want to introduce, sort of show people what you sent them.
What time is it?
8:24.
8:24. Well, I did parking standards as well. First draft of the parking standards. No, she says no. Well, I'll just tell you that what we've done is two big things. All right, so number one, we've taken the parking table requirements, the ratio requirements, which are heavily dated, and we've used the most recent standards in the Institute of Transportation Engineers guidebook. So what ITE does is they go around the country and they survey the parking needs of different types of developments in different locations, in different communities, and they update their standards every 5 to 10 years. And so they just updated them again, I think, last year. So these are really fresh. And communities for a long time have used the ITE standards. The difference is that, you know, when they were there 30, 40 years ago, which is reflected in our standards, things were very different. You know, the suburbs were places where people lived only, and they didn't have a lot of, commercial, they didn't have a lot of industrial, they commuted into the cities. Today, it's a lot different. There's a lot more happening in the suburbs, and so people are not going as far to work. And there are opportunities to live in a mixed-use area where you don't have to take a car. So the new IT standards reflect that. So we've incorporated those into our standards as a starting point. And then I think we need to go through that both with the people that represent the town as well as the development community to see if we're on the right track. Secondly, we made it easier to do parking garages, structured parking. But again, I mean, just like we're allowing more flexibility in the uses, there are design standards for that. So we want to make sure that they're well designed. We want to consider placement. We don't want them to be overlooking the street. If they are on a street or a public street or a private street, we want to see activation in the bottom floor. We want to be looking at the parking garage on which is on the street. So there's a lot of things that will go into that. So yes, we're enabling an easier process for structured parking, but we're also attaching design standards for that.
I have a question for you. Is there something you want from us for this? Like, do you want us to
I want
write
you-
down and send it to you? What do you want?
I want your feedback, everyone's feedback. So yes, I want you to go through it in detail. If you have any questions at all, send them to Melissa.
One way to do it is to downloading it and adding comments. You can do that on the Excel form. It's actually that might be a little easier because you can highlight a cell and just say comment to the cell and then just return it.
Right.
Or send it to you.
What's that?
Or send it to you, Melissa.
Yeah, or send it to me.
Any
We're all going
questions?
through it. I mean, it's a
Any
team
questions,
effort.
any comments, any suggestions, you're crazy, that's a bad idea, or something new. Like today, we heard today about something we had forgotten, and that was allowing the possibility of having automobile showrooms at the malls, which happens a lot. And that's not been allowed here, but that's something we want to consider.
Well, yeah, that's really for electric cars and then new kind of, again, as things evolve, it's smaller footprint, showroom.
Because auto dealers are much smaller, footprint is much smaller, not carrying as much inventory, especially even some of the newer car dealerships. They just want a place where they can show their stuff, and people can, order or something.
Two things on that actually. So like we create, make also a distinction between the showroom and service, because even we get use name like the Cobra, like the Tesla, the Lucid, the Rivian, you know, you can have showroom where sometimes you don't even buy the car there, because you know, Rivian for example, or any model you buy one, most of them. Second is they still need a service. Now they don't want to change their oil, because there's no oil, right? But they have batteries, they have to change the wheels. So since you just mentioned that, it came to my mind that maybe when you get drafted, it's also included potentially service also. But yes, showroom, the showroom for the service. Maybe since there is enough parking, you can have 10 spots of parking when you go and you go up to get out the car. And all the malls in USA that they will that also. So they create something really cool actually.
Right, so,
And that's my
so send me your comments.
Oh, I have to
And we'll put up.
I thought I was saying. It's recorded.
So, yeah, maybe I'll feedback, and then we'll put it together, and we'll try to respond, and certainly we'll bring it up and address it next week.
What's the timeline again for,
What's that?
what's the timeline for?
For all the different changes we need to make, probably, hopefully like end of July, mid-August, we have the full series of drafts.
Yeah.
But again, we need to go through that and vet it and make sure we're comfortable with it.
So you can target in January town meeting?
Yeah.
January.
So right now, I'm working on the dimensional standards, which includes the floor ratio, they have to have a conversation.
Just don't wait for May town meeting.
What's that?
Don't wait for May town meeting. That's
Don't wait for me to try to get it done in January.
Yeah, January's good.
Well, then we're gonna have to work hard. Okay.
Okay, so, thank you so much. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna conclude now, maybe if you have a chance to go through the information we sent you, we'll be setting up another couple meetings. I think we have to give some consideration to, summer schedules, but what we'd like to do is be pretty, thinking of probably the fall to give us, some more consistency to the meetings, so we can really ramp it up.
Maybe remote, it might be easier to get people, it'd be easier to see the.
Oh, so going forward, the remote, did you say
I think that would be
Yes.
better.
So I think going forward, through the summer, we had planned remote. I think we felt it was important to at least get this first one in person again, and then we're gonna have the next few remote, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
true.
that would work well.
So we're gonna have that.
Thank you, but I have